Well, hello and good evening. It's great to be with you all in this way. I am Dan Miller. I'm one of the post-secondary counselors at Stevenson High School. You are here attending our first gen night to learn more about highly selective schools, and we're thrilled that you're with us. So let's get started. We have an amazing group of panelists and presenters tonight with you. So I'm just going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves. So I'll turn it to my wonderful colleagues.
All right, I'll go first, I guess, reading left to right and I guess in alphabetical order. So Rick Clark, Georgia Tech, really pleased to be with you and looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. I will follow Rick up. My name's Timothy Fields. I work at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia.
Thanks, Tim.
And hi, everyone. My name is Corinne Smith. I'm an associate director of admissions at Yale University, and I'm also a Stevenson alum. So I'm doubly excited to be here tonight.
To our Stevenson families, I'm also a Stevenson alum. I feel like I should share that now that Corinne. So we have 50% of our panel are Stevenson alums, but some, Rick and Tim are very familiar with Stevenson, and super grateful to all of you guys for agreeing to be here. I'm just indebted to you, so thank you. You guys are in for a treat because these are amazing people in our profession. All right, so we wanted to kind of first set the stage for all of our families and just kind of talk about what is a highly selective school. So when we talk to our families, we really kind of broadly define any school is really, in our eyes, highly selective, where their acceptance rate is 25% or below. So if they're admitting less than 1 in 4 students, we feel like they're highly selective kind of in our eyes. That's kind of how we view them. There's a large degree of unpredictability and uncertainty with who will be admitted due to the various factors we're going to kind of hit during our presentation. When it comes to highly selective schools, the grade point average of the student, potential test scores that might be included in an application do not guarantee admission. There's a multitude of factors that we're going to highlight that underscore the complexity and, again, some of that uncertainty and therefore unpredictability of kind of highly selective colleges and universities. As I've shared, again, this is a little redundant, but it is a bit unpredictable who's admitted, that there's not going to be a way to kind of feel confident that a student with a certain transcript, a certain test score, a certain profile might be a strong candidate for admission or might be likely to be admitted because of how competitive these types of schools are. And again, part of this is it's year to year. So sometimes we're basing our assumptions, our knowledge on previous admission cycles that we've all been privileged to be supporting our students and recruiting and working with our students and families on. So some of this is historical, but it has evolved over the course of the last many years and even decades. And part of our information we're sharing with you during this presentation is based on just that collective information we have. We tend to say that more space-limited programs can be even more unpredictable or uncertain just because they tend to be a little bit smaller. So they sometimes fall in, but not always are, within some of these majors that you're seeing in front of you. That could include students that are looking at engineering or particularly computer science, if that falls within an engineering program. Certainly anything within the business fields of general business administration or related majors in business. Certainly nursing, especially for direct admission to nursing, tends to be a bit more selective because those cohorts for first-time freshmen are pretty small, generally speaking, and architecture as well. So these are kind of the top probably 5 that we see that tend to be a little bit more even unpredictable just from a major specific perspective. Some examples of some highly selective public universities throughout the country that are not represented on the panel. We just wanted to kind of go a different way. So again, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, the University of Michigan, the College of William and Mary, the University of Florida, University of Texas at Austin, any of the UC campuses. We gave you a few examples of Los Angeles or UC Berkeley or UC San Diego, the University of Washington in Seattle, and or the University of Virginia are all kind of falling kind of in this category of if you don't live in those states. Unfortunately, we do not, from admissions standpoint for our Stevenson families, admission is highly selective and therefore very unpredictable at all these schools. Some examples of some private schools that you might have some familiarity with, you've heard of them or you've done some research, you can sort of see the list in front of you. They kind of run coast to coast, smaller schools in the New England area like Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby, to the West Coast like the University of Southern California, to Ivy League institutions, to smaller selective schools in the Midwest like Carleton or Grinnell, to urban institutions like New York University or NYU, to Carnegie Mellon University or Johns Hopkins. There's just a variety of institutions in front of you that are the most selective schools really in the world. And these are just a smattering of examples. There certainly are more. We could have filled the screen. We hope this gives you a sense of kind of some of the institutions that we're kind of talking about from a public and private school lens. So we decided to use our panelists scattergrams, and hopefully as you work with you guys as students and work with your families and us as counselors on using your resources, and Naviance hopefully is one of those resources that families are utilizing to kind of figure out where do you kind of fall within kind of the competitiveness pool potentially, even within highly selective schools of some of these institutions. I just grabbed screenshots of our three panelist institutions. So we'll start with Georgia Tech. And again, if you haven't seen a scattergram recently, you'll see a little legend on your own scattergram for you guys as students. You'll see kind of who was admitted to maybe who was not admitted based on the scattergram. If you look at the sort of middle of the chart, this is for Georgia Tech, you see it's Stevenson High School data. It's largely self-reported, but we do the best job we can of using all the mechanisms to look at reporting to ensure whatever was self-reported is actually verified. So we try to do our due diligence. So I always tell families it's probably not 100% accurate, but it's pretty darn close. So hopefully that's a pretty good sense for you guys to get a sense of. We had quite a few students in the last 5 years apply to Georgia Tech, and we did have these students admitted, and it wasn't always at the same GPA or test score range. This is by ACT. And the beauty of these scattergrams for families is that you can kind of filter this based on ACT and or SAT. I just chose ACT for the purposes of this, but you can see the average GPA for accepted students the last 5 years or so was a 4.71 GPA at Stevenson, quite high, and the average ACT score was a 34. So that's Georgia Tech. Then for Emory University, Tim's institution, you again see a lot of students that have applied, a few more of those green squares in the case of Emory, but still incredibly selective institution with the accepted average as a 4.57 GPA, and the average accepted ACT in this case was a 33 in the last 5 years from Stevenson. So here is the scattergram for Yale University from Stevenson High School. Again, as you can see, the average GPA, quite high, average is a 4.79 with an average accepted ACT of 35. You may not see a lot of green. I think there is some green behind some of the sort of mixed in the graph legend there, kind of on the far right-hand side. We absolutely have had students admitted from Stevenson High School to Yale. Also because this is an ACT breakdown, they might have submitted their SAT scores. That might be part of some of the missing data points as well. So just want to make it clear, if you're looking at this and wondering, oh my gosh, nobody gets into Yale from Stevenson, that's not true. That's not the point of this slide. We just want to kind of illustrate the scattergram for all of our colleagues in the panel. So those are just a snapshot of some of the highly selective admissions trends in terms of what the data says for our panelists. And now I'm going to turn it to Corinne to talk a little bit more about highly selective admissions.
Thanks, Dan. And this is a huge topic, everyone. So we're going to cover just a few key points here, but there's so many things that go into highly selective admissions. What we're going to spend a little bit of time touching on are these goals here. What is holistic admissions? How do we review those files that you all send? How might you create a really diverse college list that captures schools you're interested in that are also interested in you, right? What is demonstrated interest? We'll come back to that one a little later. And then we'll touch on a couple types of financial aid and how to predict your own cost. But really, again, this is a very high level overview. So you have wonderful counselors, a wonderful college career center. Make sure to go talk to them about any of these things. But we'll do what we can here. On the next slide, I'm going to kick us off just with a really brief overview of what holistic or whole person admissions means. So in many countries around the world, a lot of times a student is accepted just simply based on an entrance exam, or they're applying to a very specific department that asks for very specific qualifications. For most schools in the United States, especially private institutions and these highly selective institutions, we're not reviewing applicants in that way. We are instead using this process called holistic admission. That means that everything a student submits in their application is there for a purpose. It is reviewed and taken into consideration before we make a decision. So there's not a time when we say, here's a GPA and a test score, the student is in or out, or we're going to keep reading a file or we're not. We really are considering all the different pieces and aspects that a student is showing us and telling us about. And so that really does, as it says right here, goes far beyond having the perfect GPA and test scores. Something that I like to really just be very transparent about is about 75 to 80% of an applicant pool at a highly selective institution is academically qualified. They could do the work at our institutions. They have kind of the classes, the GPA, the test score we'd expect to see. They've been involved in activities we'd hope at the leadership levels we'd love to hear about. And so we're really looking at other parts of the application to see if they're a good fit for us. So in holistic admission, we are considering those academics. They are important. We are first and foremost academic institutions, but academics is a lot of things. It is number one, your transcript, the classes that were taken, the rigor of those courses. Did you challenge yourself more and more over time? Maybe that first year was a little rocky. Transitioning to high school can be really tough, but a student kept working hard, maybe went in for some extra help, and their grades improved over time. We also look at those GPAs, test scores, if a school requires them or if a student submitted them. I know we'll come back to that in just a second because it is a very hot topic. But we're looking at a student's extracurricular involvement. We don't need them to be the leader or captain of 8 different things, but what are they really getting involved in after school? What do they like or love doing? Maybe there's 2 or 3 things that they really spend their time on. And that's something we want to see. Essays, super important to our processes, mostly because it's the thing that students can most control at this point in the process. They can't go back when they're seniors and change 1 grade from freshman year or add 8 activities, but they can tell us about themselves and show personality. And that's a lot of how we determine fit for our institutions. Recommendations, that's very dependent on the school, whether they ask for 0 or 3 or 5. Really just pick teachers that like the student. It'll all be fine, I promise. And then interviews can be very dependent on the institution. Some schools offer them, some schools don't. Some have informational interviews, some have evaluative. Some are with admissions officers, some are with alums. It's just very variable. And that's one of the things that I think you'll hear throughout this presentation. How does it work at a specific school? Well, it depends on that specific school, right? Dan, throwing it back to you. I think you were wondering about testing, right?
I was, yes. Thanks for pairing that up. Yeah, so we know, the 4 of us know that the world of standardized testing has changed significantly since the pandemic began. So I'm curious to kind of get your guys's lenses and perspectives on testing at your own institution. Anything you want to add about kind of just some kind of how testing has evolved in the last, really 3 or 4 years, especially.
I'm happy to jump in a little bit there. I mean, one thing, and I'll probably talk about this in some of the slides I cover, is, first and foremost, a lot of schools around the country, I think the percentage is close to 80 now, 80% of schools not requiring students to send in tests and giving them the option to do so. And I think that this is where having a solid college counseling team is really going to be beneficial, because you just showed some 5-year charts with a scattergram, but you could also show trends. I mean, you could show year by year, you could show the last 2 years. And I think that's always helpful too, is to see how things might have moved and changed. And particularly here in the last 2 to 3 years, that's absolutely been the case with testing. And so I think the other thing is, like, our school is really optional. Does optional really mean optional? And a lot of schools will say that, and many schools really mean that. And it is good to have data to support that. And thankfully, you all, using Naviance, I think can back that up where it's true and maybe refute it if it's not. And that's really helpful, I think, as well. Georgia Tech is a school that requires students to send in test scores, SATs or ACTs. It is not ever going to be the reason a student is admitted or necessarily a student, is denied. But we are a public institution, and the Board of Regents governs our decisions on many things, one of those being testing. And so you may find that some schools are being required to have schools or students send in tests. Now, how you use them varies, right? So I would say we've leaned away from using test scores in the last couple of years and diminished their value in the holistic process, even though we require tests to be sent in as part of an application. So just those are a couple quick thoughts.
Thanks, Rick.
I'll just jump in very quickly. Just say for right now, Emory's test optional, and we're evaluating data from year to year to look to see what we'll do moving forward. But my assumption is will be test optional for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Tim.
And Yale is also test optional, but only for this year. So current seniors applying, I can say with certainty, we will evaluate test optional. We're not making any judgments about why a student does or doesn't submit testing, but we do not typically make an announcement for the next year until February or March. A lot of that is because the tests themselves are changing and trying to improve, and we're evaluating those. But also, the landscape changes. And what we've been seeing a lot lately is that students are choosing not to submit testing, which is actually strong and might have helped them in a process, right? And so that's something we don't want to lose track of either. Not submitting testing does not mean that we're overlooking or moving quickly through the rest of the academics. A student who has a lot of lower grades and doesn't submit testing, we're actually going to spend more time looking at their transcripts and evaluating those grades. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Without testing, we do have to look at other areas of academics a little bit more strongly.
Great. Thanks, Corinne. And we'll turn it over to Rick.
Great. So, I think one of the biggest pieces of advice that we would all give, and that you'll hear from anybody that's done this work on either side of the desk, is the need to apply to a range of schools from a selectivity standpoint. These are a couple of the ways that you could categorize them. This idea of a safety school, target school, or reach school. I think the other way you hear sometimes people talk about it is more predictable offers of admission versus less predictable offers of admission. But regardless, one thing to just sort of level set on is many people, especially in communities like Stevenson, and especially in cities like Chicago, you'll read plenty of articles and hear from lots of journalists who make it sound like it's extremely hard to get into college. And that is patently false. The average admit rate for four-year schools around the country is about 65%. Most schools in our country admit most students who apply. And in the years ahead, it will be easier to get into college rather than tougher, because the domestic pipeline is shrinking because of the birth dearth of the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. The international pipeline is threatened and also in many ways shrinking because of competition. And so seats in colleges are very prevalent. They're just not extremely prevalent in the type of institutions represented tonight or in that sort of reach category, right? So going to college, absolutely attainable. Getting into college, getting into multiple colleges, and having choices and options. And I think that for a family and for a student, it's important to reframe. And I guess my hope would be, and I'm sure my colleagues would agree, like, I think that success in college admission is not a certain bumper sticker or a certain, whatever it is that you're going to, a hoodie that you're going to wear, but instead, like, having choices and options. And as parents, whether your kid is 3 or 13 or 33 or anywhere in between, like, we want our kids to have choices and we want our kids to have options. And so one of the best things that a parent can do, or a supporting adult around any student who's applying to college can do, is coach towards options and choices. The way you get there is by thinking about places you actually want to go, and thinking about who you are as a student and who you are as a learner, who you are as a person. And you can absolutely, one of the beauties of American higher education is you can absolutely find schools who have very wide ranges of admit rates that fit who you are and what you're all about and how you're made and wired as a learner, as a person, in all of these categories. And so, one of the things that's just important to recognize is that most schools around the country are leaning heavily towards the academics, what we just sort of hit on in that holistic side. GPA matters a lot. What you took and how you did in those classes matters a lot. Test scores on some level in certain places matter, but the numerical is going to be a driver for admission decisions in those safety schools in particular, and to an extent in the targets. And then you really move into the reach and you start to have a lot more factors that are taken into effect. It's going to be a lot less predictable. And one of the bigger mistakes that students can make is thinking, I'll just add more schools to my list, but if they're all in one of these in the far right bucket, that's not going to increase your odds or your overall chances of being admitted to those places. And I think you're setting yourself up for disappointment in the end. So I think that is, and your bullet at the bottom, makes a lot of sense too. Like, as a student or as a family, worrying about what you're excited about, worrying about what you're interested in, worrying about what is affordable for your family and not what other people around you are doing, what other people around you are saying. And, sort of that comparison is the thief of joy. It really stands true in college admission. I guess we'll go to the next slide. Here again, this sort of I think shows this in a bit of a different way, but this is the idea of a more balanced list. I have a colleague who talks a lot about this idea of having 5 first choices. This idea that you don't have a number one choice, you don't have a dream school or a top place. And I think that one of the reasons for that is not so much just about like possibly just being disappointed, but like, I think that short sells who you are as a person. I mean, even on the screen, I mean, all of us probably could have gone to a variety of different colleges and, quote, been happy or been successful or enjoyed our college experience. And so to fool yourself into thinking there's only one place for you, only one sort of dream school, or the world's going to fall apart. And certainly as a parent, coaching towards a small set of institutions, I think is really undermining the kind of potential and the dynamism of our students and of our kids. The only other thing I'll add here at the bottom is to kind of hit on deadlines, and just to say that they exist for a reason. Deadlines exist because of schools trying to build a class and because of what else is happening in the ecosystem of higher education. We like to think about higher ed as being this sort of idyllic, utopian, non-connected to dollars and cents and competition, but that is not true. The truth is that here in Atlanta, what Emory does has an impact on Georgia Tech. What the University of Georgia does has an impact on Georgia Tech. And you set up your timeline and you set up your deadlines in order to be competitive for the students that you're trying to enroll. And sometimes that's going to be on a national level. Sometimes that's going to be on a very local level. And it all is driven by the sort of targets that you have or the institutional priorities that you have. So real quickly, early action is basically a deadline that falls typically in the fall. And it is saying, I'm interested, but if you admit me, it's great to know earlier. But I'm going to also kind of wait and see where else I get in. And I want to weigh all my choices and options, right? Again, ultimately, in my opinion, the goal of college admission. Early decision, or ED, is this idea of saying, I have determined that this really is the place where I would love to go. And if I'm admitted, I will commit to going. And so if you're applying an early decision plan, it means that you have arrived at feeling extremely confident that this is your true, match. This is your best fit, right? I hope, though, and I guess another hope in this is nobody would think, I have to apply early decision. Now I just need to figure out where that's going to be. That's the wrong way to sort of approach the early decision landscape or the early decision concept. Regular decision would be a later deadline, often in January, sometimes in February, depending on the school. And it's basically, again, non-binding. It's just later. So, really this sort of sets up how it goes. If you apply early action or early decision, you will either be admitted, deferred, or denied. If you apply in regular decision, you will either be admitted, waitlisted, or denied. And so those are some of the possible decisions that will come. Happy to talk about any of those later, maybe if we'd like. But hopefully that's a little bit of a sense of this idea of building a balanced list and the deadlines that surround all of that.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick. Tim, let's turn it over to you.
Yeah, so obviously, we've talked about holistic review. We've talked about building a list, deadlines, but especially kind of in the current landscape, given the Supreme Court decision, which is removing the use of race from the evaluation of applications, we think it's important that students kind of look beyond traditional colleges as far as where they're going to school. That there are schools that have been around for a number of years that serve any number of different populations. And so you have historically Black colleges and universities, you have Hispanic serving institutions, and by no means do these type of institutions only serve these populations of students. However, they were set up to support these students, and throughout history have done a very good job of that. And so as you go about building your college list, we hope that parents and students keep an open mind, not just thinking about kind of what is the education and the end goal that they're going to receive, but what is their experience going to be? What is their life going to be on that campus? How is their identity going to play out? What does diversity look like? What are they looking for? And so we think it's important to look at historically Black college universities, Hispanic serving institutions, and then there are other schools. If we could go to the next slide. There are tribal colleges for those who are Native and Indigenous. And then there are other schools for Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions. And so as we think about kind of the larger higher education landscape, and we started this off talking about selective college admission and those type of institutions that we see in U.S. News World Report are on ESPN. But we just want to highlight that there are over 4,000 colleges and universities throughout this country. About 2,000 of them offer bachelor's degrees, and a lot of them serve different populations, have different majors. And we just want people to keep an open mind and, just realize that, you are going to have an experience. What is your life going to be like during those years, usually between 18 and 22 while you're in college? And, if identity is something that's important to you, if being surrounded by people who maybe have a similar experience is something that's important to you, we just think it's very important to kind of keep an open mind as you go about this process. So next slide, as you go about this process, there are going to be some schools that look at demonstrated interest. And what is demonstrated interest? Because the reality is, as Rick was going through, some students are going to apply to lots of different schools. There are some schools that want to know, how interested are you in us? That, as they go about making their class, they know you're applying to a lot of different places. And so they want to know, are you just applying to us for the sake of applying? Are you generally interested into coming to our school? And so there are some schools, and this is something I encourage you to ask admissions officers, ask, the school directly, do you track demonstrated interest? And that's where they're going to be like, did you visit our school? Have you attended a virtual event? If we came to Stevenson High School, did you come to that high school visit? They want to know that you have done something to show that you are interested in that school beyond just completing the application. And so you can see there are things, obviously a campus visit, a high school visit, an interview in person, a college fair, social media, any number of ways. And so if you do have a school that is on your list that does track demonstrated interest, you want to ask them, what does that mean? For most institutions, it's simply that you do one of these things. So if a school says they track demonstrated interest, it does not mean you need to email the admissions officer once a week, that you need to go to that school, that, by the amount of things that you do, it does not increase your chances. It just means that they want to know that you have taken some initiative in, reaching out to their school or showing interest in their school beyond simply just applying your application. But I encourage everybody, this is a question that you want to ask schools directly. Emory University does not track demonstrated interest. So this is something that we, stopped doing years ago. So we have, if you don't come visit me when I come to Stevenson, that's fine. If you don't do anything but apply to Emory, you'll still be just as competitive as somebody who has done all of these things. So we do not track demonstrated interest, and I'll let my colleagues chime in about what their institutions do as pertains to this.
At Yale, we haven't tracked demonstrated interest in a long time, so we know that it can be very challenging and cost prohibitive to especially come visit our campus. So all of the events that we put on, the visits, the virtual programming, it's all for a student and a family's benefit to get to know us. We don't track any of this in our admissions process.
Yeah, same for Georgia Tech. We've kind of always said an application is demonstrating interest, and continue with that. One thing I will say, is that when it comes to being on the wait list, schools will often say, okay, you accept your spot on the wait list. And then, it could be worth just going that extra step to send an email and say, I'm still interested, or check in occasionally, especially now. I mean, wait lists are starting to unfortunately be way more protracted out through the summer in some places. And so, ultimately the way that sometimes anyway, the way classes are getting finalized can be quick. And so there is some benefit to just sort of continuing to raise your hand. But I would say that that's where I would again lean on the college counseling staff, because they're going to understand how this works at particular institutions and be helpful in that regard.
Fantastic. Great point. All right, we'll turn over to Corinne to talk a little bit about financial aid.
Awesome. And this is one of those topics that is so extensive. I know that you all have other programming on this, so we're just going to touch it very briefly. With the institutions on your list, it is really important when we talk about that idea of fit, that we're talking academic fit, social fit, but also financial fit as a part of this. And so just to understand how these schools might give aid, it is one of those things, again, it's based on institution, it depends. But a few key terms to be aware of here. When a school gives you a financial aid package, the number on our websites can be really scary of what the total cost of attendance is, right? The vast majority of students aren't paying that full cost of attendance, which could include tuition, housing, meals, books, travel to and from that institution. Most students are getting some kind of financial aid from those schools. And financial aid is a little complicated, but here are some of those terms to know. So grants and scholarships are really the same thing. It's money that a student doesn't have to pay back to the institution. A need-based institution is going to base those grants on the family's income and assets. It's going to be a lot of tax return information or wage slips, stuff showing how much your family is actually making in a given year. Those scholarships that you see there could be need-based, but a lot of them are actually merit-based. They might be based on a student's academics, test scores, whether they're an athlete, a good musician, a whole range of different things. And those will be included in a financial aid package. It's very common in a financial aid package to also see work study. That's typically campus jobs. That could be everything from working in a library to a lab, doing research, singing in a choir so a grad student can practice their conducting. There's so many jobs on a campus. And then federal loans. Some schools might be no loan, where you won't see that at all. Some schools might have private loans. Some schools have federal loans. Again, if you see those, great conversation to have with your college counselor and talk through how you want to pay those. Now, most schools are going to say it's okay to take a small amount of loans. That's totally normal. And, you're going to these great institutions that are going to end up having a great career path for you. I don't think any of us on this call are going to recommend that a student is taking $80, $100, $200,000 in loans to go to an institution when there are so many schools that they could go to for little to no cost with some of those merit or need-based aid scholarships, right? If we go to the next page, I just want to highlight how you might be able to figure out what it would cost for you to go to a school. Every single school in the country is required on their financial aid website to have something called a net price calculator. This is basically asking all of the questions that you might find in a FAFSA or free application for federal student aid. And it takes a good amount of time, but it'll give you a pretty accurate depiction of what your family is likely to pay. There are some other calculators that families can use. One of them in particular is called My Intuition. That one's a little faster. It typically asks about 6 questions, takes 3 minutes, and gives a range that your family is likely to fall into. The more accurate you are in putting information into the calculators, the more accurate they will be. One great thing about the net price calculator is you can go directly to their website and also compare schools to each other. So just something to keep in mind there.
Fantastic. Well, we've reached the end point. So many great nuggets of wisdom from you three. Your final tip, I'll turn it to each of you to share one more thing with our families about highly selective admissions, something that they can take away beyond all the other great things that you've shared during our session.
I'll start us off, simply, I mentioned this a couple minutes ago, but there are a lot of colleges and universities throughout the country. And, all of them, have great research facilities, have great faculty, have study abroad programs and all things that they can offer your students. But I really implore you to really be thinking about, what's your why? Why are you applying to this school? What can this school offer you? And really kind of dig into that, because if you're just applying to a school simply because of the name, simply because of the rankings, that may not provide the educational experience or the outcomes that you're looking for. So I really implore everybody to define what's your why for every school that you are thinking about.
Thanks, Tim.
All right, and we'll let our Stevenson grad go last here. So I'll go next. I do think that whole concept of 5 first choices is really important. Just this idea that if you do what Tim's suggesting and you really think about kind of who you are, what you are trying to accomplish, and why you want to go to college to begin with, you are going to find through all of those thousands of schools, hundreds of schools, good fits and good matches. I think you'll be excited about this. The thing that I guess I would say is, like, people think that college admission too often is something they have to do, that you've got to kind of get through it. You got to take this test, you got to fill out this form, you got to submit it by this certain date. All the things we've talked about sounds like a to-do list. But I guess what I would hope, again, is this idea that, you would keep the end in mind, and the end in mind is college, right? And good college students are not working off to-do lists. They're thinking, they're researching, they're testing assumptions. They are growing because they're keeping an open mind, which is what, you know, Tim just kind of walked through. And so if you think like a college student, you will be a good college applicant. And I think that would be kind of my biggest tip, is think like a college student, act like a college student, and you will be a good college applicant.
Thanks, Rick.
And then I think that I'd say, just knowing the Stevenson culture and having gone there for so long and been involved in the community for a long time after, I think it's really important to talk about these highly selective institutions, as Dan said at the very beginning. These acceptance rates are very unpredictable, and you really might have a few of them on your list that you love, but it's important to remember that if a school has an acceptance rate of 5%, applying to 20 schools with acceptance rates of 5% does not mean that you have a 100% chance of getting into one of them. That's just not how math works. You're joking about that a little bit earlier. And instead, really, as Tim and Rick and Dan have all said, to think about that list and what's right for you. There is not a student who is only a fit for one institution, and that list that you're applying to really should have a range of schools that you would be happy at. And if you have that, then wherever you end up going, you'll be happy and great and successful in life because you found a place that's the right spot for you, and it's not based on acceptance rates or name or recognition or anything like that.
Amazing tips from incredible panelists that are like, you know, champions in our profession. I think you guys, I would just say, to like tie it all together, as counselors, we support our students and our families, and we want sleep and sanity for all of you. And I think taking some of these nuggets of wisdom will hopefully provide more opportunities to sleep and find restorative opportunities to find that sense of calm throughout this process. Because I think, as we've shared, there is quite a bit of stress and a lot of information out there, and it's confusing and overwhelming for many people in an understandable way. And we're here to shed some light of trying to make this more manageable and chunkable, so that you can hopefully just have some sanity or more sanity throughout the process, because that's what we want for all of our families. We hope this has been a helpful opportunity to just learn about a topic that many of our families ask us as counselors. And I'll turn it back to our session hosts. Enjoy the rest of your night.